Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to this number 102 of our Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk About sessions. It's nice to see a number of Circle members and those of you who are not members. Welcome to all who haven't attended before as well. For those of you who this is your first time, just to give you a bit of information, the Circle of Wine Writers was founded in 1960 in the UK, and today comprises of 260 plus members who are comprised of wine writers, broadcasters, educators, and other professional communicators. We're 50% in the UK and now have extended to over 50% in outside of the UK as well. There's more information on the Circle website about the Circle. You can find out about joining our organisation. If you'd like to join our mailing list for these events, then please do just let us know. I'd now just like to hand over to Meg Maker, who's our new chairman of the Circle of Wine Writers, who will introduce the speaker today. Over to you, Meg.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea. It's really a joy to present Kevin Day to you all. I've known Kevin for some years and had the privilege of traveling with him and seeing him work. And he is a consummate journalist. Really admire his work, and I'm sure he has some great things to say to us today. So Kevin is an American writer and photographer. He's the founder of Opening a Bottle, which is a digital wine magazine that's just celebrated its 10th anniversary. I encourage you to check it out. In addition to being a fellow Circle member, Kevin is a French wine scholar and an Italian wine scholar, both with highest honors. He's contributed freelance writing to various publications, including 750 Daily, which is a pro publication, and also Wine Scholar Guild and elsewhere. He's also an experienced educator who regularly conducts seminars and virtual tastings for his publication's subscribers. So in addition, Kevin has long trained both his pen and his lens on wine and their makers. He juggles an array of gear to capture the stories behind the bottles. And the resulting visuals and text complement one another. They each do different work. They each tell a different aspect of the tale. So Kevin is going to share his hard-won insights, both practical and philosophical, with us today about ways that we ourselves might enhance our own narrative storytelling with rich imagery. So with that, I will hand it over to Kevin and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Meg. I'm honored to be here today. Thank you so much for tuning in and jumping in on this. For me, I was just saying this before the call and I went and grabbed it, but I started taking photos when I was in high school. My dad was a TV journalist. He thought this might be something that'd be good for me, so he bought me a camera from the 70s right here. So this is the original, a Nikon FM. And it really taught me to do composition and to do everything manually. How does a camera work? And it was really a good tool for me. But throughout a lot of my adulthood, I was trying to figure out how do I do photography, but I was also doing this writing thing. And it wasn't until I found wine really in around 2011 or so that it all came together as one thing. And so it's really been a treat to be able to experience the world of wine through both the lens as well as writing about it. So I'm excited to be here to share this today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and we'll get into the presentation. So as Meg noted, hopefully everyone can see the thumbs up with the screen there. It says getting the shot, getting the story. I use all kinds of things. I use an iPhone, so I'm going to be talking about that today. I also shoot with a digital SLR, but I also have doubts about how I'm doing things. That's natural when you have a craft. You kind of assess your gear. I'm in the middle of doing that. So I'm going to speak to some of that today, but all of this is in service of capturing a sense of place, a sense of personality, what it is that I saw when I was there. And actually, it's a huge tool for me when I'm writing, is to be able to refer to my photographs and to be able to understand that. So for today, I'm going to be covering these things. After a quick introduction, I'm going to talk about pre-trip, before I'm going on a trip. So a lot of this is focused on how I travel. I do join press tours often, mostly focused on Italy, mostly focused on France, sometimes here domestically in the United States, but my passion is really in Italy. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that. So before a trip, how do I set my objectives? How do I communicate my needs to the people I might be working with? And what gear do I bring? And then during the trip, what are my priorities? I'm going to talk a little bit about what it's like to shoot when you're with a large group tour versus a small group tour, well as independent travel. And then I'm going to get kind of to the heart of the matter. How do you use a camera, whether it's a digital SLR, an iPhone, to tell the story of what you're seeing? I'm going to give you some tips Some of them are real basic, things you've probably heard about photography, but maybe you just thought about in a new way. I'm really not going to get into too much technical detail. I'm not a gearhead, so I'm not going to be talking about the latest and greatest in technology, sensors, and those kinds of things. It's really just about how do you use this as an aid to tell the story. And then we'll wrap up with just some tips about workflow afterwards. You know, how you shot all these photos, what do you do with them when you get back? And we'll wrap up with Q&A. So I'm going to keep an eye on the clock here so I can kind of keep things moving. Hopefully wrap this in 40 minutes so we have a good discussion at the end. So as Meg noted, my publication is Opening a Bottle. I started on 2014 on a whim. I was looking to see if I could get into the wine industry. Somebody told me, well, you should write about wine, see if you can describe this thing. And so I set up Opening a Bottle that day, and it really turned into a photography meets journalism meets wine education kind of space, particularly during the pandemic. So this is the publication, and I'm showing you this because this is what sets the agenda for me when I go take a trip and how I shoot photos and how I prioritize my time. I really love telling stories, long form stories. So the articles that I write sometimes go a little bit long for the internet, but that's part of the joy, is bringing these photos together in a way that really tells the story of a person, of a town, of an appellation, of a grape. There's a lot of different ways, and those are the things that really inspire me. But I also do some reports on wines. I review wines. I have a subscriber base that helps fund the website, cover some of the costs of developing it, cover some of the costs of my travels a little bit. And I invite you all to check it out. But the other thing that kind of happened during the pandemic was I started doing Zoom classes. And I had, people who were interested in paying for ticketed entry to attend a class. They were at home, they had wines. We knew that we would travel again. So let's revisit some of those things. And I continue to do that to this day. So I bring all that up because when I'm looking at a trip and, it's a perspective, itinerary, I'm thinking to myself, since I'm part storyteller, part educator, and part wine reviewer, it's kind of this weird hybrid. What are my objectives? Is this trip going to fit for me? When I'm considering a destination on my own for independent travel, these are the things that are going to really fuel, my objectives and my research going into the trip. For me, photos are going to communicate a story, yes, but they're also going to cover key concepts. It could be vine training, if that's going to be the story. It could be, the particular slope of a vineyard. All of those things that might show up in a wine class. I want to get a lot of photos so I had a lot of resources to draw from. So for me, when I'm all done, success is kind of the number of usable photos I have post-trip. A good trip is 100 usable photos. A great trip is 300, 500 photos. I mean, last summer I went to Abruzzo, Beaujolais, and Burgundy, all, one after the next. And I came back with, probably 600 images that I could use for many years to come, which is great. That's, for me, a success, is to be able to have a library, an archive of photos to pull from for the work that I do. Because even if I'm writing a story immediately after that trip, there may be something down the road that I can pull from that, would complement a future story. So my priority on these trips, because of that, is photography. Yes, I want to meet people. Yes, I want to taste wines. I want to take diligent notes. But to get a sense of place, I can't duplicate that from here in Denver. When I'm there, I got to get the images that will help me, fuel a lot of the editorial down the road. My second priority is to record audio. I use Otter, which is an app on my iPhone. It transcribes it. I have a record of it. That's, very key. So a lot of times I'm, camera in one hand, phone like this, right? So I'm sure some of you are familiar with that posture. But video is a distant third for me. And I want to kind of convey this to you all early on. It's okay to know your limitations with this. I'm just really burning the candle at both ends on these trips. And video is the kind of thing, because you have to have good audio as well. I've shot videos, but all I hear are my footsteps crunching on the gravel, right? Or there's wind and you can't hear what the winemaker is saying. I'm just not an audio technician. So I've put a bit of a pause on shooting video as a priority. So instead, I think pre-trip about, okay, with this itinerary, where our accommodations are, am I going to be able to be in the vineyards in the morning and the evening? And if the answer is no to that, I ask myself, well, what's the size of this group? Do I have opportunities afterwards to extend my stay? And then I look at my wallet and see how much money I have to do such a thing. But to me, these are kind of the things that I want to kind of look at so that I can enable my photography side of things. Because morning and evening light are really the best light. That's what you see of this photograph here from the Langhe Hills in Italy. That's early morning light. That's really rich light the scene just really kind of comes to you in a way that is very vivid. I also, look at whether the itinerary is mostly indoors. So in February, I went to an event in Tuscany, the Anteprima, where a lot of the event itinerary was in Florence, in indoor rooms, tasting wines all day long. And I had to really think long and hard about whether that suits my journalistic purposes in terms of conveying photos, conveying a sense of place and story. It was a tremendous opportunity to really immerse myself in Tuscan wine, so I ultimately did it. I'm glad I went. I may go again. But what really was the benefit of it was I had an extra day afterwards to go into Chianti Classico. And just this morning, I published the story. It's on the front page of Opening a Bottle about these 3 wineries that I visited and the historic preservation efforts that they're doing. So that really made the trip worthwhile for me, was to be able to do that. And then lastly, I research images of the area, like what are the cliche photos that everybody's taken of this area? How do I avoid that? How do I possibly come up with a new angle on it? Sometimes if I'm independent travel and I have a rental car, I actually research nice viewpoints so I can get there. Or maybe I ask somebody who's helping me plan the trip what they think are good viewpoints. All these things are kind of going into the pre-trip preparation. And on top of that, it's really important to communicate. I tend to over-communicate possibly. So if it's a PR firm that is, bringing me on a press trip, if it's a consorzio, I let them know, look, I'm a photographer, so I travel a little bit differently. And I need to have a little bit of time to get the best shots. I'm not asking for that time right away, but I'm letting them know that, I need to have a little bit of freedom to wander sometimes. So if it's in a group setting, which I'll talk about in a second, that I just want them to know ahead of time. I may not look like I'm listening because I'm looking through the lens. It just helps for me to kind of ease up, feeling like they know that that's who I am and that's how I travel. So conveying the nature of my work is really important. I will even say things like, my priority, number one, is to get good images, so I may have an opportunity for follow-up questions. Would you be able to help me, aid in all of that? But I also want to convey too, it's really important for me to maintain professional decorum in all of this. I don't want to be the kind of person who holds up a group because I've got the camera. A lot of people are there, they've got their own objectives, and I totally respect that. So I've missed a lot of good photos by joining a press tour, and that's okay. I have to kind of accept that and know that, just because the shot maybe didn't come together, we've got to move on. Lunch is waiting. That's an important thing to convey. For independent travel, when I'm visiting winemakers on my own, or maybe a consortium is helping me arrange site visits, I let them know, right away, I want to get a breadth of vineyard photos, or I'm really hoping to get a sense for the landscape this way. I'm looking for these special features, that possibly are directly tied to a direct story pitch that I might be working on. I want to get a sense for facilities. I let them know all this ahead through email. Just, this is who I am. This is what I'm looking for. I'll even say, I'd love to take a few casual portraits as well. I mean, nobody likes to be surprised by having a camera thrown in their face, right? They know that they're meeting journalists, but maybe they don't realize that a professional photographer is coming, or someone who's got all this gear and a backpack and is in their face with a camera lens. Like, it helps to let them know that, give them a fair warning. And oftentimes, once they hear that, they're a little bit more relaxed. Maybe they want to wear like some different clothes or something like that ahead of time or whatever. It gives them the preparation to kind of know, okay, this guy's coming. Part of what he wants to do is get some casual portraits. I did have an instance last year in Burgundy where the local tour operator who was hired to take me and another rider to these different wineries, at the end I said, boy, Stevie, this was a great trip. Thank you so much for everything you did. And he said to me, you know what, Kevin, I knew it was going to be a good week. Do you know why? And I said, why? He said, because you introduced yourself and told me what you wanted. He's like, that made my job so much easier to be able to say, oh, I know what this guy wants. And that really meant a lot to me, to feel like, okay, somebody got my messages ahead of time, helped make this trip a little bit smoother, and I was able to get my objectives. So anyhow, sometimes I'll also even convey like a specific story angle, like, take me to the Bernate Vineyard. I know the Bernate Vineyard is going to be a subject of a story, just to let people know that they can prioritize the time ahead of time. That really helps with independent travel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about gear I bring. So some people might look at this and kind of laugh because it is a lot. And I am a bit of a dinosaur, as I mentioned, because of the way that I learned photography. I travel with an iPad mini with a Bluetooth keyboard. I pop that out to take notes when I'm tasting wines. It fits nicely into my backpack that I wear with my camera gear, or progressively, I'm moving more towards like a shoulder slung bag. This is my camera. I shoot with a Canon 5D It's a Mark IV. It's an expensive camera. It was in 2017 when I got it. Less so now, but it still takes great photos. It's got a great sensor on it. I tend to go with a 50mm lens. This is on the camera for most of it because it's small, it's light, it brings in a lot of light. You get real good clarity. There's no distortion. I also have a tilt shift lens, which is my clunky indulgence. This thing is an architecture photo or architectural lens that I use. It's completely manual. It's crazy that I even travel with it because you can do a lot of those effects in a camera. I'm sorry, in a post-production nowadays. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then I also go with a wide angle lens. So I'm kind of, that's a lot, right? I mean, that's a lot to bring. You'll notice I don't have a zoom lens that I willingly bring. And that's because I don't feel comfortable composing as much when I'm going in and out. I feel like I get a little lazy and I just zoom in on the subject rather than getting closer to the subject. So I like to travel with a fixed focal length lens. I mean, it's kind of nuts, but that's how I get really good results, I think, is by composing the shot and being in that mindset. Sometimes I bring a flash, rarely do I. I tend to replace it with this, which is a Lume Cube portable. It's like a little light that you can pop on and off, you know, if you're shooting indoors, you know, in a cellar or in a restaurant. Sometimes I bring a tripod. That little clip gets the camera mounted to the tripod. I've forgotten it before and brought the tripod, and it's just extra weight. So that's something I'm starting to jettison. A tripod I'll only use when it's nighttime photography. But I'll talk a little bit about that in a second because even that's going by the wayside for me. And of course, you got to bring your battery charger, your battery card. This is a lot, right? And then, of course, I have the iPhone 13. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's important to know kind of some of the differences. So when I was in Abruzzo last year, you know, I tend to look like a paparazzi. So this is the one photo I have of how I look when I travel. I have a backpack, which I'm holding up here. I mean, it's a good weight. So you go into a tight space like a cellar. It's not ideal. But what I do love about this backpack is that it unclips here and this little fanny pack rotates so I can get lenses, right? So as a photographer who likes to shoot with maybe a wide angle lens or something like that, it helps me. But people tend to kind of like make jokes about my backpack. I welcome it. It tends to make me, you know, sweat because I'm, you know, climbing around in the summer wearing that in a vineyard. But nonetheless, that's where my SLR goes, is in there. You know, when you have an SLR camera, you got to have a good case for it. And the advantages to shooting with this camera for me is the crystal clear optics. It has a better sensor than really any of the phones that I've experimented with. Now they're getting more and more advanced on the phone side of things. And as someone who's publishing online, you don't need that high a resolution. In fact, it's better to post smaller sized photos on the internet because it'll load faster. So maybe I'm a little bit stuck in my ways in that regard, but I do like the optics by shooting with an SLR. That's the main reason why. And I also just feel a lot more in control of the composition with an SLR, partly because I've been shooting with them for a good 30 years now. But I feel like an active participant in the scene when I have an SLR. But what bothers me about it now, especially that I'm getting into my 40s, especially since I have arthritis in my foot, especially since I have to, you know, stuff myself into a transatlantic flight and I get all stiff in the back, weight. It's cumbersome to juggle these things. Switching lenses in the moment is getting to be more and more annoying to me. I'm losing my patience with it. So I am looking at a different way of doing this system. I also say there's the temptation to adjust too much in post-production. You know, just because you shoot raw, you can really bring things out in your photos. That can take too much time. I can get a little bit too hung up on the details and fall behind on assignments, fall behind on other work. So that's one of the real drawbacks to shooting with something that has that large of a file size. So the iPhone 13, obviously the 15 is the newest one. I'm shooting on a 13, so that's why I'm bringing this up. Portability, lightweight, obviously that's great. It actually has a really good dynamic range. I mean, you could take a shot in evening light and the sky will still be bluish, kind of midnight blue. You'll get good colors. But when you zoom in on it, you tend to get a little bit of compression and loss of detail. But it's really quick for quick documentation. So I have to, you know, retrain myself to say, normally I'd take a photo of that with my SLR, but it's just better because it's, you know, handy to just get a shot of, you know, a sign or something like that that tells part of the story. I'll do that with my iPhone. However, there's some drawbacks to shooting with an iPhone for me. It's really hard to control lens flare. I'll talk about that a little bit later. In backlight situations, I've found that it struggles. And also there's this kind of compression that happens. And so this is an example of it. When I first got the iPhone 13, I decided I'm going to use this only for indoors. I'll just use it for my indoor photography. I'm going to put my camera away. I won't have to carry that backpack into cellars. Well, part of the problem, like this here at Il Marinetto in Tuscany, when I met with Alessandro Mori, was zooming in on the photo. It looked kind of like garbage. I mean, there was just like a watercolor effect. This is an iPhone setting that can kind of happen, and they've been working at improving it over the years. So I can't speak about this on the iPhone 15 and whether it still does this. But this is the camera taking all this light and pulling it into the phone and getting it so that it's nice and even, but it loses some of the detail because of the compression that happens to create the file format. So what I'm really eyeing is this camera here, which is not cheap at all. So I'm saving my money, but it's a Leica Q3. And the reason I like this camera is there's a service here in the United States called lensrental.com. You can rent cameras for a week or two and test them out. And so if you're interested in looking at a new camera, see if there's a rental service nearby. I have fallen head over heels in love with this camera because it does everything that my SLR does, and it's that small. And I can actually go with a shoulder slung bag. I cannot worry about the weight. I can feel actively participating in the shot. I'm looking through a lens finder to a viewfinder to compose the images, and it has incredible range. So when I first got this on the last time before a trip, I took it to a wine tasting here in Denver, and this was a snapshot. I mean, this is what the snapshots look like coming out of this camera. So I was kind of feeling like, okay, I can shoot this in low light. It's lightweight, so my hand doesn't shake when I'm taking pictures, so the image fidelity is a little bit better. But then when I took it to Venice a few days later, this was the photo that really was the proof in the pudding for me as to why I want to go in this direction. This is a nighttime photo that I shot handheld at 50th of a second. So that's just kind of on the fringes of being slow enough of a shutter speed that you might get a little image shake. But when you zoom in on the details of this image, you really see that dynamic range coming in through the sensor. And this is really, cameras are really getting so much better at doing this, where you can see all this detail. You can see the smiles on their faces. There's no kind of cluttery little dots, which are known as noise, which you sometimes get in darker images. And even this lion statue at the top was like perfectly crisp. So for me, I thought if I could take that camera into cellars, I'm going to feel really, really good about the kind of shots that I can get, the compositions. And really, all this is to say what camera is best for you is really the one that's most fun to use. I mean, if an iPhone is most fun for you and you feel like it enables you to tell the story the best, that's what you're going to use. That's what you should use. Everybody's different. So for me, I'm a little bit of a control freak about my compositions. So that's why I'm going to go, stay with an SLR. But I'm progressively looking for a way to get out of this big cumbersome system and getting into something that's a little bit more compact. Okay, let's talk about during the trip, managing priorities. This is going to go a lot faster now. I swear, I got some of the details out of the way. So if some of you see yourself in this photograph, it's good to see you again. But I travel on these press trips, and there's pros and cons to joining a large tour, a small group, and traveling on your own to get the shot as it relates to photography. So with a large group, one of the best things about that's the anonymity. You don't feel the pressure like the winemakers are looking at you for questions, or that you have some sort of kind of responsibility to keep things moving. You can kind of float around the edges of the group and get whatever shot you want. But again, it's kind of crowded. You want to take a portrait of somebody. Oftentimes the way that goes is you pull out the camera to get the photo of them, and other people bring out their cameras, and their eyes start wandering to all the cameras. And then you're kind of doing the over here. So it oftentimes can get a little bit tricky to get that kind of intimacy level that you want with a good portrait of a producer. In a small group, it's kind of that perfect mix of sometimes you can be anonymous, you can kind of float around the edges and really devote yourself to photography, but then you can also be kind of, get your questions in. You can get their attention, you can get to the heart of the story that you're pursuing, but sometimes you can feel the pressure of keeping the group moving a lot more in a small group. So sometimes I feel a little bit rushed. And then a solo trip, is really where you can set the agenda. You can take your time, obviously. You can frame the priorities however you want. One-on-one with winemakers is great, but sometimes when you're on your own, you don't have somebody else to bounce off with. And so they're not as candid in the photos that you take. They're looking right into the lens. You kind of have to, it helps to have someone else to play off of. I find like a group of two, if I'm traveling with one other person, the photos always come out great because that's when I can be taking pictures while they're asking questions as well, if that makes sense. Okay, let's talk about composition and telling the story with your camera. I'm gonna do a quick time check here. Looks like we got 15 minutes, so keep this moving. This is another photograph that I took with one of those smaller cameras that I rented. This is the Leica Q2, so it's a little bit less advanced than the latest model. But again, this is a moment where, this kind of brings everything together that I'm gonna talk about in terms of the angle of the shot, waiting for kind of a magic moment to happen, being prepared for it. Let's talk a little bit about how you can tell the story with a camera. And one of the first tips I want to give, this is my dad talking in my head, I hear his voice, is avoid locked knees. There's so many times where you take a photograph where you just want to be standing up straight, taking the shot from here. And if it's down, if a bottle down low, you're angling your camera down here. Sometimes it helps to just really move around. You kind of have to be a little bit shameless about, being a paparazzo in the moment where you're kind of trying to get the angle, you're trying to get the shot right. That really, really helps to get lower to the subject matter at times and also to get closer. Sometimes with zooming, you don't get closer, you don't compose the shot, you're just getting in there to really frame it. And I really encourage you to start getting more active and getting closer to the subject matter to take better photos. That can work with vineyards. So with vines in particular, sometimes it's a struggle to really convey the character of a particular old vine, for instance. So this is a Nerello mascalese vine on Etna that I think was like 120 years old. And I could not for the life of me convey that. I just kept trying to get the shot right. I'm looking through the viewfinder, trying to back up. Nothing was working until I actually got dirty and got on the ground and was looking on the, on the panel on the back of my camera. And I got this kind of lower worm's eye view looking up at it. That's when the grandeur of the old vine kind of came together. Getting closer, in this case, this is, some pasito grapes that are being plucked off and being destemmed by hand. So much of this is the texture, right? And so many of the things that we encounter as people who are privileged enough to travel for wine are the textures of this process that goes into making wines. And you get that when you get closer. And so it's just a simple matter of learning in the local language. Can I take a photograph and memorizing that and just asking, can I take a photograph as I'm getting closer to you? That just really enables a lot of compositions. Also getting closer to vines. Sometimes if you just fill the frame with some grape clusters, it can be really, really dramatic. And it's okay that some of this is out of focus, right? That's the depth, that's the dimension of a vine. It's really, really good to kind of play with those elements a little bit. Here's another example of getting lower and closer to someone, to a person. I will say that, if you're shooting with a wider angle, so in other words, kind of like a 28, 24 millimeter setting on your camera, whether that's your iPhone or an SLR, people start to get a little bit warped if they're on the edge of that frame because there's some distortion naturally with a wider angle. But nonetheless, if he's kind of in that middle third there, kind of on the edges of it, you're going to get somebody who's not going to look distorted. You get the whole environment around them. And in this case, getting lower made the subject more about him and his vision than the actual dish that he's composing. So again, another winemaker portrait, wide angle is the Medio Pepe, getting the mountains in there, getting the vineyards, the village, but making him razor sharp and crisp in the shot. But, getting him, kind of all of that together, that's kind of, again, enabled by getting closer to your subject matter. This will also work for bottle shots, I'll mention. So one technique that you're seeing here that's also being implied is side light. So I'm going to talk a little bit about light in a moment, but it's amazing how much more impactful a wine label is if you get lower. So I'm going to be writing a tasting report on Merlot from Collio later this summer. And, when I get my photos in, I take them against this wood wall that I have. I arrange them. I try to get as low as possible to get all those photos right. Just because I think the bottles just look a lot better. It's a lot more compelling for my readers to be looking at those shots on the site. So as far as composition's concerned, always be thinking, where do you want the eye to go? We're living in a three-dimensional world and we're taking two-dimensional shots. So I always shoot on what's called aperture priority. So if you're familiar with how cameras operate, the aperture is basically the ring that opens and lets light in. And the lower the setting, the more you're going to have that's out of focus. So in this case, with these Nerello mascalese vines, I wanted those grapes to really shine, but there was just this little window that showed the summit of Mount Etna in the distance. And so I blurred that a little bit. As I look at it now, I wish I'd shot it a few stops up. So in other words, from an f4, maybe let's see what it looked like at f7 to see if, Mount Etna could be more, sharp. It helps to take a few different exposures of the same thing to kind of see which one works best for you. But again, this was really about where do you want the eye to go? And then what's the secondary afterthought for the viewer? It's going to be that mountain in the distance. And you can even see some people in my group who are kind of milling in the distance there, a little bit out of focus. There's just kind of an evocative quality to that photo because of it. Also, look for layers. I mean, we're, when you're looking at a landscape, it's one thing to just have this dramatic viewpoint, right? But what's the foreground? What's the midground? it's not just all background. You know, you're there in the scene. If you could get lower again and bring in that foreground, it doesn't matter if it's out of focus. It adds an element of intrigue to the shot. It leads the viewer into this sense of place. So this is in Fleury, in Beaujolais. Again, you know, you think of the roses, you think of flowers, you know, there's a sense of place to that. And I loved that splash of color in the middle of this, but I wanted the chapel on the hill to be the subject that was in focus. So really just kind of adding layers to your shots will help to make them a lot more compelling. I'm not going to spend too much time on tilt shift photography because it's obviously it's a very manual intensive process, but you can do in post-production in your phone a tilt shift feature. If you just scroll to the far right, you can kind of force it a little bit. And what a tilt shift is it's basically the way a camera views focus is through planes that are kind of in dimensions relating to the front plane of the camera lens. A tilt shift is basically taking that and moving it. You're manipulating the focal plane so that if you want something that's nearby in focus, something in the distance that's focused kind of in a strip through the middle of the photo and everything around it blurs in, you can do that with this lens. And so everything that's kind of in that middle strip there was intended to be in focus. The vineyards, the mountains, they're kind of out of focus. It just kind of creates like a dreamy quality a little bit. This is a vineyard in Provence where I did this feature. I shot a tilt shift photo of a tractor that was going by through the vine rows. And, you know, the middle of the trunk is out of focus, but the top of the tree is not. And those things are in the same distance to the camera lens, but you can do that with a tilt shift. So there's two different features you can look at on your iPhone where you can do that. Again, you know, you want to just do it just subtly so that people don't even realize you're doing it, if that makes sense. Otherwise, it starts to look a little bit fake, a little bit forced. Let's talk a little bit about light. Looks like I'm okay on timer at the moment. We're almost wrapping up here. Sorry if I'm going too quickly.
Yeah, no, Kevin, you're good. You can take your time. We have plenty of
Okay.
time. Yeah.
Okay, great. This is probably one of the most important things anyways. Let's talk a little bit about where your light source is coming when you're taking an image. So oftentimes with a photographer, so much of what you're doing is putting yourself in the position to get the shot rather than waiting for the shot to come to you. So when I travel independently, that means I'm getting up early because the best light is when the sun is low in the sky. And harnessing that light, particularly through backlight, which is what you're seeing in this photograph, can be really, really a winning formula. So always be mindful of what light source you're working with. So this is the Brunate Vineyard in Barolo. So you're going to see a lot of Barolo shots here coming up in the next few slides. You know, in this instance, I was up high on the hill looking down. Obviously, the sun's coming from the far right horizon over the landscape. And what happens with that light at that angle is the leaves catch it and they just glow with radiant quality. But then the shadows are really, really deep around them. And with a good camera, which pretty much all of us are carrying now in our pocket, you can get that kind of a shot. I'm not shooting into the sun directly. I'm shooting off angle a little bit. So when you're doing this with backlight, you want to look for what's called the flare. And as you move the lens, you'll see it move around. It's basically the reflection of the light source on the glass of the camera. And sometimes flare can be really dramatic if you do it right. Sometimes it can really interfere and be distracting. But sometimes you can get it just right where the flare disappears. You're getting that rich color, that backlight quality, the shadows, the highlights, and you have a really dramatic photograph to take. This also works with those vineyard photos. You get closer, lower to the subject matter, right? I'm crouching down pretty low to these Nebbiolo vines, and I'm using that 50mm lens, this one here that's kind of short, that doesn't have any distortion to it. And every now and then you get this angle just perfect where the flare isn't a geometric pattern on the lens. It's actually this kind of blown, kind of blotchy, hazy, gauzy flare. I love that quality. And I love trying to capture that both in portraiture as well as these detail shots. Some other things you can do with backlight is a actual sun flare. So to do this, it really helps to set the camera on a higher aperture. So f/16, for instance. That means the lens is contracted. It's really bringing in a little bit of light. It's kind of a pinhole quality. And so when that light comes into the camera, it flares out like this in a dramatic way. It really works great with an SLR. This is one of the things I've not been able to figure out how to do properly with an iPhone. And because I'm an SLR guy, I haven't really troubled myself to try to figure it out. But a lot of times the flares are just very, very different on these kinds of lenses because you have three lenses working. Sometimes depending on the mode, it's trying to calibrate between all three lenses. And also the lenses are so thin, you don't have this kind of effect of layering flares going through the actual mechanics of the camera. So the flares are just very, very different with an iPhone. But backlight can be very dramatic. And also don't forget, backlight can work indoors too, particularly if there's a window in the room where there's kind of this nice, softer light coming in through that window. Look for those opportunities. It can be really dramatic. This is my friend Adam, who's, taking a whiff of Barbaresco. There's a window to the over left side of his shoulder, and the light was coming in and it was actually reflecting off of a white surface and illuminating him. Perfect, and then this glass of wine from Friuli, it's just the colors, the natural softness of shooting backlight. I love it. That's one of my favorite conditions. Side light can be dramatic for a different reason. In this case, I wasn't thinking to myself, "Ooh, I'm in the mood for a side light photo." This was just available light. We stopped on the way back to Beaune. As we were leaving Savigny-le-Beaune, there was a beautiful wall stretching into a Premier Cru vineyard. And what you get with that is a lot of texture. You get a lot of good, rich color, and again, that dramatic light. But it's because the light is low, it's casting those hard shadows. So you always want to be looking at light and shadows when you're composing shots to see what works. I have some examples coming up where it doesn't work. And then this Lume Cube that I was using, I put this over to the side of these champagne bottles and got great side light. I side light all my bottle photos. I just like the way side light looks on indoor surfaces when you're trying to capture a product, an image. It just kind of creates a little bit more visual intrigue where you can see the light kind of catching the bottle, but you also see the sharpness of the shadows countering all of that. That makes for compelling imagery. Top light can be really tricky to work with. Sometimes you have a spotlight and it can be a little harsh. Sometimes it just depends on the nature of that top light, but sometimes it can illuminate shadows in a weird way where maybe like the nose casts a shadow that's difficult, or sometimes it works. And in this case, with this photograph of Niccolo Monferrari at Borgo de Tiglio in Friuli, he gave me a quick second to take a portrait. I was like, "Do you mind if I take a portrait?" And he's like, "See." And that was it. He wasn't giving me anything other than this photo here. But in the end, it worked because, you can see a little bit of a smile on his face. You can see the shadows. There's a lot that this guy knows that you want to know, so sometimes with portraiture, top light can kind of, and side light can kind of cast a shadow that kind of leaves you wondering a little bit more about the subject of that photo. Who are they? What are they interested in? What do they know? Midday light, noon, this can be so hard to work with. The sun is harsh. Shadows are really harsh. Some cameras really, really fail at top light. This is a photograph of Etienne Delarche. He's a producer in Burgundy. And, the first photo on the left, I think is a big fat fail for me. Like it was just, there was something about it. I looked on the back of my camera after we left the vineyard and I was like, "Boy, could I get another shot of you?" We tried it a few other ways. Of course, I'm so worried about the light and trying to get his face properly lit that I forgot to ask him to do something other than this pose. So I got essentially 3 photos of him doing the same thing. Really wonderful guy, but very, very soft-spoken. So sometimes these things don't work out, and that's okay. I think as a bald man, I can tell you this thing reflects surfaces pretty harshly. And so there's not much you can do to account for that. But nonetheless, working with light, figuring out the best way to do it, I probably ought to I thought to myself, maybe I'll get a better picture of him when we're indoors a little bit later. And indeed, I did get a shot of him, which I show in a second. Sometimes it's a mix of light. So, inside Jean-Marc Burgaud's cellar, he's backlit, he's also top lit. And you can see the shadows of the bottles. There's a lot of different light sources at play there. I just thought it was a kind of an intriguing scene. Sometimes you have to kind of work with what is given to you in that moment. And sometimes that moment is cloudy skies. It's diffuse light. So when that happens, you're actually in luck with portraits. You don't have to worry about hard shadows. You don't have to worry about part of their face getting blown out with light. You end up getting really good color saturation. The background isn't merely as dramatic, maybe, if there were hard shadows on a landscape. But in this case, with Giovanni Minetti from Fantodi and Penzano behind him, he's really properly lit. And the reason he's smiling, and this is a little other, photography hack, is he's actually talking with Sylvia, who was with me, who was bringing me. And I said, I just want you to be natural. Just, I'm going to get a shot of you with Penzano in the background. But if you guys just, could talk about what you were talking about, don't mind me, I'll just get some shots. And I waited for that moment where she said something that made him smile. And I got this photo of him, and I love it. Also, with diffuse light, you get great color saturation. So on the left is a vineyard on the Mosel River. It was a cold, cloudy, late October day, but man, did those fall colors really, really pop when you have diffused light. So if those are the conditions that are presented to you, start thinking in color. Think about what types of things you want to bring that are rich and vivid. You don't even have to adjust for saturation afterwards in post-production because the light is going to be that way. The photograph of Ilaria Faluga, again, she was outside her cellar. And I was just like, just have a conversation, talk with, your colleague. And I just waited for the moment to show up, and that's how I got the photograph. To me, it works a little bit better than having them looking straight into the lens sometimes. So this is not an error. This is not a test pattern, this photograph, but this is diffuse light in Barolo. So you can see the hazy light on the right and how the town of Lemoore is just kind of lit up, and it's really kind of it's kind of just this hazy kind of mess, kind of mysterious. And then there's all this color on the side. This was part of a series of photos on the Brunate Chapel. So I chose to actually fill the side of it with all those colors, and I got that great, rich, saturated color because of the light conditions. So that's just something else to kind of look for, is just, when you're thinking diffuse light, gauzy light, how do you get those good colors? But there's also no substitute for just always being ready for some sort of magical moment to happen. If it's raining outside, you're thinking, I can't get good shots. No way. But you know how this happens. Skies part, rainbow comes out, suddenly you have the best light conditions you ever imagined. And that's when you want to be ready to have your camera going. And the same goes with people who are kind of firm, or maybe, they're not smiling. You want to catch that moment where they, suddenly ease up and you're ready for it. Not to just keep saying like I'm living in the Brunate crew of Barolo, but I've actually gotten some really great demonstrative photos there. This was another one. I couldn't quite convey the feeling of dustiness there until this beautiful little car drove by going up the road, kicked up the dust, and added that dimension to it. To me, that conveys the feeling of Barolo. My initial thought was, I'm going to take a photo of that because it's a cute car, right? But it wasn't until later that I saw how the S curve of the road leading up, the dust, I was like, oh, that's really what it feels like to be there. Take a photo of your shoes if they're dusty. I mean, sometimes it's those little details that really bring people to what this was like. More moments where you're trying to find somebody doing something kind of organically. This was happening to the right of me when I was attending a tour of a boathouse in Burano many years ago. And it was like the light came in, this guy came out and started tugging on a boat. And I was talking with somebody, but I just, hold on a second. I had to get that shot because it was just so dramatic, and I'm really glad that I did. So I eventually got my portrait of Etienne Delarche, and it happened when we were tasting from Barrel. And it was because he stepped off to the side to step into some side light. And it was just sitting right there. Camera was able to catch it. I just quickly took the shot. But to me, that was the one that, really captured his character a lot more than when he was in the vineyard. Some more examples: diffuse light, Felix Meyer in Alsace. Again, he's talking with somebody else in my small group. And it's just the mentality of saying, I'm going to keep shooting even though other people are talking. You're listening to their conversation a little bit, but that's when you can kind of get a little bit more of like a private moment with this person. Another tasting, Mark de Grazia, in Etna, it was actually when people were pouring wines, he was very serious throughout so much of it. Somebody made him break, and he had a little bit of a laugh and a chuckle. And, I just love the layers of that kind of a shot. So I'm going to keep this moving, but, this is just, again, you maybe even like, it might be a canned pose like this one here with Manu, who's a producer in Burgundy. His cousin drove by at that moment. He saw him and pointed at him, and it was like, because I was looking through the lens the whole time, I was able to get that shot. The other shots in that series, maybe not so successful. Last composition tip. You've probably all heard of the rule of thirds. I want to think about this in, other kind of ways a little bit. Sometimes it's helpful to shoot with the rule of thirds. 10% of the time I'm trying to break it a little bit. And that's just for me to try to keep myself honest. But if you're not familiar with the rule of thirds, it's basically look at your shot and divide it into 3 lines. So you have basically 3 quadrants, or not quadrants, but 3 sections going through the middle this way, 3 going this way. And then you train, the composition, as such. So anytime you look at, you can turn these lines on your iPhone, it'll have them there. So you're probably familiar with seeing this. But what's nice about this photograph here is it's actually 4 sections. You have the wall, you have the cyclists, you have the vineyard strip and the the village in the distance. And really the rule of thirds, even though it's 4 things, it really nicely did the work for me. If you start thinking with this pattern and start utilizing that, make the gate a little bit off center, put the vineyard right through the middle, you just get these nice leading lines that it actually looks much more natural as a composition. And that works also for vertical photos, obviously. In this case, a sun flare on a pool, the lines, they just kind of balance. It's nice symmetry. a simple landscape at sunset, you know, in Montepulciano, put the horizon line at the third mark. Don't put it right through the middle. You know, if it goes through the middle, it's not as compelling of a shot. You know, the church, put it in that lower right spot where those lines intersect. It just leads to a lot more balance and visual kind of intrigue when you can use the rule of thirds that way. And then how do you break it? You fill the frame. So, you know, in this case, I was on a tour. We were looking at sparkling wines. You've all seen this before. Again, using backlight, seeing where the available light was, getting the angle of the bottle so that they looked as most compelling as possible. Sometimes it's just the texture of a roof. You know, I mean, it's like just looking for these details. All of them lead towards kind of being able to have a body of work that can lead to a photo essay. Oh, I am way over on time. Sorry. Okay, workflow. When the trip is over, first things first, I back up my files. So always make sure you have a mechanism for backing up. I also would say try to find a way to name your files so that you can find them. I like to name mine by year, month, date, then the place that I went, and then some sort of number code afterwards. That has come in handy so many times over, you know, 20 years of shooting with digital photography that I can reference photos back by finding that kind of, I think that was 2007 that I was on that trip, or 2011 or whatever it is. I go through all my photos once they're loaded and I rank them. I give them a 4 or 5 setting, and then I filter 4 or 5 and get rid of everything else on my viewing screen. And those are the only ones that I look at and adjust. And adjusting is something where you can go crazy. You can always kind of like, you know, tweak and adjust. And after a certain point, it's easy to lose sight of what reality looked like. So the only thing that I will use AI for now when it comes to photos, and Lightroom has a lot of AI features built into it now, is bringing the sky back. So the sky has so much sunlight in it that oftentimes the clouds really don't show up the way that your eye sees them. And so this is like the one little indulgence that I've allowed myself, is to utilize AI to bring the sky out like I did in this shot on the right. And I would also say go easy on saturation. So this is the first photograph that came out of the camera. You can see the sky's a little bit more pale, a little less textured. AI actually can identify those clouds. You can adjust it and make it, it's almost like there's a different exposure value for the sky than the rest of the landscape. And then just a little subtle adjustment to the colors, and it just has a lot more pop, and that's actually how my eyes saw it. So those are just some tips for kind of doing those things. When where the rubber really meets the road for me is when I select those photos in a collage and see whether I have a photo essay. So when I was in Friuli a couple of years ago, I went to meet Ivan Rapuzzi at Ranchi di Chiala. Fascinating man, one of the most interesting people I've met in wine. And part of the reason why is he's a world-renowned entomologist. So his family saved Scupatino as a grape. They're famous for their Scupatino. And this is the original Scupatino vineyard that you see here. I got a portrait of him with side light where he, you know, is kind of a dramatic evening light moment. And then as I kind of just gathered the photos and just looked at them on my screen, I kind of felt like there was a mood of like, God, this really takes me back. And it wasn't just all landscapes, and it wasn't just photos of him or photos of his bottles. It was everything working together. The detail shots, the landscape, the portraiture, just all those little minutia things that my eye saw. And when it came down to it, he invited me up to look at his bug collection. And we actually went out there to the top of the house and looked at the insects that he has collected with his brother over many years, traveling as far and wide as Tibet. That was really a sacred moment for me because he let me into his world. He was so passionate about it, and he saw that I was passionate about it through photography, that we just had this kind of connection that led to a really good story. And, you know, as I was building this presentation, I didn't even really think about it. This photograph here with the bugs that are pinned, the ground beetles, if you look closely on those tags, their scientific name includes Rapuzzi because he discovered those species of insects. And it was one of those little details of a photo that I didn't even see at the moment I took it, didn't see it the first time I was doing post-production, but it's a detail I find later. That's the kind of thing that makes this so rewarding for me, is to kind of gather all those things together. So I want to thank you all for your time. I'm sorry if I went a little bit over. This is my publication. I was just talking with the Circle of Wine Writers groups about putting together a special offer. If anyone wants to join for Circle members, you can use that coupon code. You know, the access gives you, you know, access to wine reviews, my list of producers that are really intriguing, some of the profiles, but it's also those recorded classes that I do, and of course supports the work that I do. My subscriptions are only $49 a year. So otherwise, you know, my free stories are there as well. Please check out the site. And now comes the hard part, is answering questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. That was really terrific. I learned a lot, and I studied art in university, so that's really great. Great insider knowledge for us. We do have we have about 10 minutes, and we do have a few observations and questions. I'm just going to kind of take it from the top. Patricia mentioned back in the day using a 1970s Konica. Patricia, if you'd like to unmute and just share a few memories of that, if you're still here.
It's okay. Really, I put most of it in the chat. The simple thing is that if you learn on an old-fashioned SLR with, a good lens and a few pointers doing a photography course, at the time we were using a lot of film. And I think that, in fact, Kevin's already alluded to that. Now you can shoot a lot of digital and ditch the bad stuff. Back then, you really had to be careful how much money you spent.
Yeah, that's my experience too. I was just thinking about, I'm kind of blessed that I came of age with film and then transitioned to digital, because I learned the basics the hard way. And then digital came in and it was like a wealth of just like, shoot it and forget it.
Yeah. I find that I was so conservative when I was using film, and now it's very profligate, but I jettison so many, but there's an awful lot more post-trip review in that case, right? So, and then John Karowski, thank you very much, Patricia, for that comment. John Karowski, you had a question about Lightroom versus Capture One for the iPhone, if you'd like to.
Well, since we're talking a little bit about the iPhone as maybe an auxiliary to, the main camera that you have, whether it's going to be the SLR or the Leica rangefinder. Congrats on that, by the way. I was just wondering what
haven't bought it yet.
But what kind of thoughts you have on either one tool or the other, not necessarily a comparison of them, but I mean, just in generally on tweaking exposures on an iPhone with a professional tool like that for something quick and dirty, or to have someone else take a quick look at and so on, if those are really valuable to you or not.
Yeah, it depends on if you're shooting RAW. So RAW is a file format. I should have covered this earlier on. I always shoot RAW, and as a result, I spend, a lot of time backing up files. They're much larger, but it's the raw data of the image, and it's all those different levels that you can then adjust. It's a lot more. You're in a position to adjust quite a bit more if you shoot RAW. So if it comes as a JPEG or an HEIC file, there's some compression there. You can only adjust so much, and I think it then renders Lightroom versus Capture One a little bit moot, because they can't do much with a JPEG file. I'm not as familiar about Capture One with RAW files as I am with Lightroom, but I mean, there's been so many times where I'd be like, oh, that would have been a great shot. It's too bad I, forgot to adjust this setting on my camera, or it's too bad that it was overexposed. And it's usually, honestly, when I use this tilt shift camera, because it forces me to underexpose and overexpose, and then I forget that I left the camera in that setting. But there's been so many times with RAW that I've recovered it, and it's still a great shot. And it's like, okay, nobody has to know I messed up, right? So Lightroom to me is really a powerful tool, but I mean, it might also be like, it just might be too much for a lot of people. I mean, it's, my mom shoots wildlife photography, and Lightroom for her is a pain point. Like, it's just managing the files, the Adobe mindset of how tools are arrayed. It can be a little bit cumbersome for some people. So again, it's just, I would just focus on the things that are going to make you still have joy doing this, and if post-production or adjusting photos is not fun for you, don't do it. So I'm sorry I don't know too much about Capture One and how that works in terms of a tool, but I feel like it's, any editing tool is only going to give you so much if you're compressing the files.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for that. Also, Emma Dalton had a question about the Lume Cube. I had the same question. Emma, would you like to unmute? Maybe Emma has left.
I see your question in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
curious. Sorry, I'd had the video off because last time the cats decided to join. So I was curious about why you were using the Lume Cube 2 rather than one of their flat screen variants. Is it because of the waterproof character or something else?
Because I bought it in 2017.
Fine.
Yeah, to be totally honest. I mean, I like the fact that it lays flat. I like the fact that it has this little, I can actually hang it on something sometimes. So I mean, even like, I have a nail in the wall where I hang a picture. I can hang it on that and illuminate these bottles from the side if I really want to. But it is oftentimes I'll take on a trip and forget that I didn't charge it, so it, it runs on that kind of a, and it also has a little cover so you could put an oranger kind of hue to the light if you really want. They have Lume Cube's really grown since I bought that light. I mean, it was actually something that I'm trying to think of which writer introduced it to me, but it was on a press trip where we were, photographing our food as we tend to do. And she was in a restaurant, and she's, pulling this thing out, and, I was like, that's really a cool gizmo. Where'd you get that? But the panel ones can really work for if you're doing classes. Like I've got a light here that's, just something I got on Amazon. I prefer to have a Lume Cube panel lighting me for these kinds of Zoom calls. So I just think it's, there's a lot of different options there, but that's why I use that one.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. There's two more questions. First, Christopher Wickens, the questions about rights and ownership and how do you control your footprint?
Yeah, not easily.
Hang on a second. Let's let Christopher. Sorry, I paraphrased, so I want Christopher to.
Well, you paraphrased it very well, actually. Thank you very much. But first of all, I'd just like to say, great presentation. Your passion really comes through in the subject. I'd just like to know how you protect yourself, because those images are just fantastic. How do you protect yourself?
Yeah, I've had my photos stolen. So, I think that's the nature of the internet, is you see things swiped, you see them on Instagram, somebody else using them without permission. And every time I do, I release the hounds on them, right? I send them cease and desist. But it's like whack-a-mole, right? Fortunately, I haven't seen it too much that it's a problem where I feel like my intellectual property's been, is everywhere now and everyone's reusing it. But there are some publications that have gone ahead and just saved a bottle shot that I've taken, and then they just feel like they can use it. So it is the kind of thing that you have to monitor. I will say that when I import my photos, you can import the metadata. I was talking about like importing, the images, renaming your files so that they have a meaningful file structure. You can also put in tags. You can put in a lot of different things in the metadata. One of the things that's always there is my copyright. I put in copyright Kevin Day / opening a bottle. And when I put things on my site, I have a caption. The caption always has that copyright there so that people know it's there. I don't know if it does a whole lot of good to deter people from swiping photos. And if somebody takes an image and they use it as their, wallpaper on their phone, okay, fine. Unfortunately, there's not money to be made in photography at this level that I'm doing. It's if you're getting commissioned to do work, you're doing photo shoots, there's just, I've had my images with Photo Shelter, which is a stock photography company, and I've had a Photo Shelter website, which is a few $100s a year. And if you go to photos.openingabottle.com, you can see my whole archive. They're all for sale, or not all of them. Some of them are just portfolio pieces because I don't have, model releases or anything along those lines. There's not money to be made there. Not many people have gone ahead and requested images, unfortunately. So it's a dicey subject. And sometimes I'll even, have to rein in how many photos I publish just for that reason, Yeah. Good question though. I wish this would be another segment that would be great, is that, have, someone with some legal background, provide, insights for all of us in terms of protecting our work. Cause I would attend that for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Christopher, thank you for that question. I mean, I think as reviewers, we publish a review and then other people lift our review, lift our words, but at least they attribute often, right?
AI now.
Yeah. So there's one more question. Alistair Bell, talking about just the pragmatics of how do you capture notes. And Alistair, are you still with us?
Yeah, really, it's a difficulty of taking photographs and being able to concentrate on what the speaker is talking about, and either remembering it or making notes of that. Particularly on the education side, where you want to know new things or talk about studies. So
I do record, and that can be cumbersome in its own way. You have an hour and 20-minute transcript of what you talked about. And sometimes I've even heard my shutter going off in the corner while they're talking when I'm listening to a transcript. So yes, if you're walking around, right, and they're giving you a tour of something, and I can't handwrite notes. That's two hands, right away. So I do record on my phone, and sometimes I try to put my phone in my pocket kind of up like this so the microphone is catching it, upright. It's less than ideal, but it seems to work. usually actually the thing I hear in the transcripts is me opening that backpack, you know, or opening the flap on the shoulder bag to get the camera out to take a shot. And also sometimes I have to, like I said earlier, I have to maintain professional decorum. And that goes for not holding up a group and not, you know, being a diva about time. And well, I haven't gotten my sunset shot. You know, everybody's there for their own reason and I need to respect that. But I also have to respect my hosts. And there's been plenty of times where I got to just put the camera away and really focus and talk to them and really make that connection and hear what they're saying and learn what they're telling me. And sometimes I'll look at my camera and go, God, I didn't get as many shots at that place. That's a bummer. But I really listened. I tuned in. So it really is finding that balancing act. You know, and everybody has a different threshold for it, right? I mean, I'm sitting here saying 500 photos is what I'm after on a trip. Good Lord, you know, that's, you know, for some of you, you might be like 40's fine, right? And that's great. That works for you. So don't think that, you know, by sharing what, you know, my vision on these things, that's the one way of doing it. But I would say definitely recording has been a very helpful. And of course, I always ask beforehand, do you mind if I record this? You know.
Well, thank you very much. It's so much to
Thanks,
think
yeah.
about. And it was an excellent presentation, Kevin. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for this opportunity. Hopefully it wasn't overwhelming.